So, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you all today and to see you all in person. It's such an incredible experience after all this time. So lovely to see you. I'm saddened to say that many colleagues couldn't make it today because of the strikes. So we are recording this event and we will send it to those people later on. But also you will get a chance to see the recording. And it's quite useful to know that there will be a recording for those people. And people who will be coming in late will be coming through the back. So apologies for that, but we are aware that people will be coming in slowly because of the circumstances. But lovely to see you. I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm Sophia Phoca. I'm Dean of Art at Chelsea, Camberwell and Wimbledon UAL, and I will be introducing Sonia and Mary today. I'm delighted to be here in the company of such distinguished guests, but also people that I recognise, and as I said earlier, lovely to see you all. I haven't seen many of you for quite a few years. Thank you for joining me in welcoming this conversation between UAL Professor Sonia Boyce, OBE and Royal Academician, and Mary Evans, Fine Art Course Leader at Chelsea College. However, before we begin, I would like to pay a tribute to Professor David Crowe, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Head of College. His recent death was a great shock to us all, and our thoughts are with his family and close friends. We are honoured to have Professor Sonia Boyce to accept our invitation today to offer this very special insight into her installation, Feeling Her Way, representing Britain in the 59th Venice Biennale, for which she won the coveted Golden Lion Prize for Best National Participation. Sonia's extensive influence also saw her make an appearance in the Biennale's French Pavilion, where Zineb Sidera's installation saw these two women artists and close friends establish diasporic connections beyond national borders. This was one of the most powerful things I experienced at the Venice Biennale, and possibly ever, in terms of an exhibition. To see this diasporic connection and the power of that really spoke to me, having come from Greece as a political exile, as a young child, and always feeling that I didn't quite belong anywhere, apart from when I was in London, where everybody seemed to belong. And I felt that these two women from London were saying, it doesn't matter where you belong, national boundaries really don't matter. And the Venice Biennale obviously has that colonial legacy that they have challenged, and that was absolutely amazing. UAL Professor Sonia Boyce came into prominence as a key figure in the burgeoning Black British art scene of the 1980s, featuring deeply personal reflections on race, class, and gender. She was a principal investigator leading a team of researchers on the AHRC-funded Black Artists and Modernism, and since 2014, Sonia has been the inaugural chair of Black Art at UAL. Today, I'm delighted that Sonia will be in conversation with the renowned artist, Mary Evans. Mary Evans's work explores the social, political, and historical frameworks of diasporas, migration, global mobility, and exchange. Her site-based installations use a variety of media, exploring the intersection between art, craft, and decoration. Evans has showed widely and received numerous awards and residencies in the UK and internationally. She has been at UAL since 2005 and took up the role of art course leader at Chelsea in 2018. Before we begin, I would also like to thank the UAL events team, Sophie Gargrave and Catherine Proudlove, as well as Sonia's producer, Nian Sullivan, for making this event happen. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and I'll pass you on to Sonia Boyce.
I think it's Mary, actually.
Actually, I'm passing you on to Mary first, and then Sonia.
Yeah. I've been told to stand over here, so I'm going to give you a quick kind of trot through my practice. I suppose, in a way, just giving you signposts of the work that I've made probably over about the last 30 years. I've always been interested in this kind of pictographic language. For me, it's direct, it's simple, yet it's informative, it's instructive, and it's been in my practice in some shape or other ever since I studied at the Rijks Academy in Amsterdam in the early 90s, where actually this language called isotype was kind of designed in the early 20th century by Otto Neurath, a Dutch graphic designer. So on the left is some of the research material that I use, and on the right is an image that I made. I've nearly always worked in a way that is kind of what I call offset. Although I did painting on BA and MA, I hardly ever dipped a paintbrush in paint and painted on canvas. It was always mediated by using stencils or masks or stamping in some kind of way. And in a roundabout way, through trial and error, I discovered that cheap brown paper that I was using for making masks for screen printing actually worked really well, pasted with wallpaper paste and stuck on the wall. And this was at the Rijks Academy in the early 90s, where I ditched the canvas. I was always aware of the frame of the canvas, and I was always trying to get rid of it, and my paintings were getting ridiculously large and piecemeal and just cobbled together. And then I ditched the canvas and just started working with the space and with the architecture, with the room. So you can see the scale of that piece of work by looking at comparing it with the door. At this point in my practice, I started to become aware of, I suppose, diaspora, race, these kinds of issues, perhaps because I was in Amsterdam, I was away from London, I was away from home, I was away from family. I had a very specific kind of experience in Amsterdam. I was an alien, apparently, even though I was an EU citizen. So I started to make work that addressed that, stuff that I hadn't really addressed in previous years on my previous BA and MA courses. My sisters are here tonight, and I came here as a 6-year-old in the late 60s, and one of the things that my next sister and I, Georgina, down from me, were really into were nursery rhymes, and learning them, telling fairy stories. So this piece of work was based on the nursery rhyme Ring a Ring a Rosie. Every now and then, so as a general rule, I work with paper in some shape or form, whether it's brown paper, whether it's paper plates or doilies or envelopes. But every now and then I'll be invited to do something that scuppers my paper plan. So this is at Queen Elizabeth Hall. I went on a site visit. It's 2007. It was the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade. And I was asked to make a kind of installation to commemorate the event. And there are hardly any walls in Queen Elizabeth Hall. There are about 50 windows. So for me, it's such a challenge to have to then think, oh, how am I going to do this? So going back to my childhood again, this is all sticky back plastic that I used to watch on telly, on Vision On and stuff like that. And everybody thinks that these are incredible backlit light boxes. It's just plastic stuck on windows. But that's kind of what I really thrive on, the work looking a little bit kind of more than the sum of its parts, looking much more than what it appears to be. I suppose this is the kind of work that people know me for, these large-scale brown paper, pasted, life-size figures taking up space in an architectural setting. This piece of work is called Held, and it's called Held wherever I do it. It's about being held, it's about the African body being held before transportation. I've been lucky enough to get a couple of Arts Council grants for research and travel, research and development, and I went to the west coast of Africa and visited lots of forts and castles in Ghana, and this was kind of a lot of the work that you'll see in the next few slides came out of that. For me, the material that I use is really significant and important. People say to me in this past, well, don't you care, you know, when a show like this is over, it gets sponged down, peeled off the wall and put in the recycling, and people say, oh, aren't you bothered about that? But no, for me, I use cheap disposable paper because to echo the way that African lives have often been considered to be cheap and disposable. So for me, the material that I use is absolutely essential to the work that I make. As a general rule, I mean, I work in quite a few different ways. This was in China in 2008, the Guangzhou Triennial. Growing up in northwest London, we had lots of friends on our road they were from India, they were from Jamaica, and Ireland, and us, and all our mums, I have to say mums because it was our mums, all had these willow pattern dinner sets. It was as though they'd all come from somewhere else, but they all felt that to be here and to be English and to be British, they had to have this willow pattern, which was all a complete, you know, chinoiserie kind of ruse anyway. It was all, so I made this piece of work in China, and visually, pictographically, it crossed kind of linguistic barriers. It was very seen and very acknowledged. It connected to Chinese blue and white pottery tradition. I made an installation in Limerick. For the first time, I grew up in northwest London, in Little Ireland, and the first time I ever went to Ireland was in 2016, and I made this piece of work for EVA, the Irish Biennale. My work is, I'm very interested in the historical and the contemporaneous kind of butting heads and coming up against each other. For this work, I was looking, at the time, it was 2015-16, there was the so-called kind of the refugee crisis, and these images that we were seeing in the media are very, very similar to images from the late 19th century, early 20th century of people queuing up to get into, Irish immigrants queuing up to get into get into New York via Ellis Island. So you know, this is kind of what that work was based on for me. Between the big installations, I kind of fiddle about with on my cutting mat, making very small things. I feel like I'm keeping my hand in. I've got lots of tools and paper drills and all sorts of things to cut into paper. So I kind of, it's a bit more, these works, the next few that you're going to see are a bit more kind of gallery friendly, I suppose, and the gallery like, oh, can you do something that we can sell and all that kind of stuff, which I try not to do as a general rule, but unless it really speaks to me. So this work for me has become really important. I just had these bent envelopes. We all know these envelopes, please do not bend. And I just thought, oh, what would happen if I cut a silhouette out of them? So, and then just inside is inserted a kind of batik inked piece of watercolor paper. So there's a combination of the African, like my dress, kind of Dutch wax, batik kind of lost wax method, and the 17th, 18th century European silhouette tradition, but made to portray African faces. And I've never, this is the only time I've ever used text in my work, but it seemed appropriate. It's a kind of like a polite notice, just, you know, just hang on a minute, please do not bend. Again, based on the Chinese, the willow pattern. These are doilies. I'm really interested in decoration and ornaments, and to using ornament and decoration as a kind of foil, in a way, to for the content that in my practice that is about diaspora, migration, belonging, not belonging, all the things that I have felt kind of growing up and continue to feel. These are paper plates. This work started in 2011 as I was just thinking about it. This is an ongoing, a lot of my work is kind of just is ongoing. And the idea was that it's called recollection. And, you know, every time somebody in the royal family sneezes, they bring out a plate or a tea towel or something. So I thought, I'm going to make plates to commemorate African people who don't get to be on these plates. I put this in because it was in Nigeria in 2018, and it was the first time I had been back there for 27 years. And still the first time I've ever exhibited there. So it was amazing to go back to Lagos and be part of Lagos Photo Festival with this installation. This kind of space really speaks to me. I just love this kind of space. This is in an art centre in northern France called La Banque, and my space was it was a former bank, and this was the bank manager's apartment that I showed in. So I kind of, you know, I had my plates, I had, you know, the wall pieces, but then I asked them to get the rug and the chaise longue and the chandeliers and all that were already there. It just seemed to really fit with the decor of the work. This is a really significant piece of work for me based on the image on the right, which is the kind of diagram of the slave ship Brooks showing how African bodies were shipped across the world. And so basically I draw the outline of the ship in pencil on graphite stick. This one is about 2.5 meters. And then I bake 500 gingerbread men and then place them onto the ship, you know, the plan accordingly. People always want to eat them. It's you know, they're gingerbread biscuits. You could eat them, but I always say no, you can't eat them. This represents bodies that have already been consumed, so they're not for further consumption. They smell amazing, you know, the spices, the ginger, but the ingredients in this work are the ingredients that African bodies were made to work on, you know, during plantation life. This is the same image, but made into wallpaper, same exhibition. So this is what I meant about using decoration as a foil. I've followed this image for a very long time and always want to try and find new ways to use it and make it work. I think this is kind of self-explanatory. This is a place just outside Munich called the Columned Hall. 100 artists were given a column each and asked to do something. The restrictions were just, you know, 90 centimetres by 3.5 metres. And I was looking at caryatids, the figure on the right, and I made my kind of caryatids. They kind of symbolise, for me, they symbolise African women who hold up so much, you know, they carry so much kind of on their heads, on their backs. So that's what that was about. I think this is my last image. This literally just opened, well, I finished working on this in the Easter holidays in March. This is Meta, King's Cross, new offices Facebook's new offices in King's Cross. And this is another example of how I had to move the work forward because I couldn't use paper. In this instance, it's a permanent commission. So all those figures, I had to work on Illustrator, oh my God. And they're all being cut out of plywood and stained and attached to the wall. And it's a bit odd because it's not a gallery, it's not a museum, it's not open to the public, it's someone's workplace. So yeah, not many people can really kind of get to see it, but I think that's me. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. This feels really, it's been ages since doing something like this. So yeah, thanks colleagues, friends, those who've come today. In particular, of course, Sophia Phoca for suggesting this in conversation, Sophie Gargrave for the operational aspect of getting all of this together, Neve Sullivan, who supports me in the studio and helps me run my life. and Mary Evans, of course. We've been having such important conversations over the years, and I'm really looking forward to, and I can see already lots of connections between what we might talk about today. So this is a short preamble to one of a set of films that are currently showing in the British Pavilion as part of the Venice Biennale. Some of you may already know that the impetus for that exhibition, Feeling Her Way, comes out of a much longer project, the devotional series that I've been working on since 1999. The devotional series gathers together a material chronicle of black British women in the music industry, performers, composers, DJs, music presenters, etc. Most names nominated for the devotional roll call have been given to me by the general public, a vast array of people who participate in what I call collective memory building. This has led to what could arguably be called the devotional collection of vinyl records, CDs, paper items and other memorabilia. The items shown here were collected between June 2021 and January 2022, and it's actually just a small selection of them. There are several artworks that have emerged from this project over the years, and Feeling Her Way comprises one such artwork. It consists of inviting 5 musicians, composer Erilyn Wallen, and singers Poppy Ajuda, Jackie Dankworth, Sophia Jernberg, and Tanita Tikaram, to come together for a day to sing in an exploratory and improvised way. The galleries of the pavilion are, if anyone has yet had a chance to see it, are alive with their different voices. And what I'm going to show now is the very first 3 of the 4 singers who met at Abbey Road Studios, and their first attempt, guided by Erilyn Wallen, to find a way to communicate through singing without a script or a musical score. So Sophia Jernberg, who was meant to join the session that day, was unable to because of COVID travel restrictions at the time. And a few days later, we were able to record Sophia in Stockholm, improvising one of the film's sessions. So if you could just play the film, please.
So thank you, that was, my goodness. Both these presentations were just so inspiring and thought-provoking, and really I'm sure there'll be lots of questions later. But just to kick off and open up a conversation, I think you both really foreground making the invisible visible. And you do that both formally in terms of the way you do it. For example, in the film, you show how the production of the film was made. So you're really reflexive. You want to show everything. You want to give everybody a sense of understanding how this is made, but also the subject of trying to kind of really address that what isn't recognized, the fact that black women are not recognised in the music industry, and many other things that you'll be talking about. And also Mary, absolutely looking at materials. You were so eloquent in the way you talked about why you use the materials you use, and how they are political, and how they are referencing the invisible histories of colonialism, slavery, the very powerful work in that context. So I'm just thinking whether you said earlier, you see those connections.
Yeah, I mean, I see lots of connections.
Yeah.
One, you know, the question about collage and the cut, and of course film, and a lot of the work that I make involves cutting and collaging and bringing people together, that are juxtaposing people together. So I kind of see, I see that as a really interesting connection, but also dealing with spaces, which one of my questions to you was going to be about when you go into a space, what are you looking for in terms of, because it's really interesting when you were talking about the 40 windows, and you know, at what point do you recognise that that's a space that, that you can take up?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, one of the things that I thought of just as you spoke just now, Sophia, was craft. You know, and you were talking about making things visible and the materiality of what we both do. You know, like you just said, showing the cut and the mechanics. Watching the film just now, I was looking at the microphones, I was looking at all the equipment in the studio and all that sort of stuff. And you know, when I go into a space, I kind of feel like I really have to respect it. I'm not going to try and change it too much. It's the space, it's got pipes and it's got radiators and it's got whatever, you know, what it's got, and I've got to work with it, I've got to work around it. And it's often, not always, some kind of architectural or cultural or historical specificity is attached to that space that then comes into the work as well. So looking at watching your video just now, I just kept thinking, Tanita Tikaram, I remember her. God, I remember her from years ago. And I just couldn't help thinking about her and her brother, who is an actor, and thinking about the culture that she's bringing to, and listen to the different intonations of the way that they were singing and where those voices come from, all that kind of thing, which is all to do with the craft of the space and what you bring, you know, what you bring to the work.
I mean, it's really, what for me is really interesting with you know, this question about the material and the working with the material and making visible almost, you know, it really cuts through a lot of my art training actually. You know, I was at art college at the end of the 70s, and it was very, you know, coming from a very kind of conceptual mode where you talked about the means by which you would make sense of what you were looking at through the materials. And so, you know, it's important for me when I'm making these films, for instance, that the crew, you can see the crew, you can see people walking through spaces, because those are the spaces that people inhabit, even though there may be this performance that's taking place that might not necessarily, might seem like a kind of juxtaposition that jars, but actually that is what makes films, is all these people actually are part of the craft of making a film. With the spaces, and there are pictures here of the installation where there's wallpaper, and I was really interested in the wallpaper. I mean, I've been working with wallpaper since I was a student in the Jurassic age, I might add. But you know, really interested in that relationship between working with the wall and actually doing something with the wall that holds the space through, you know, applying things to the wall.
When I saw your installation at Venice, that I really kind of, I think I gravitated towards the wallpaper first, before the sound was kind of there in each space and it was kind of surrounding you, but I just kind of went right up to the wallpaper and all the little facets, all these little, I kept looking at what are these images, what are they made out of, and in a way, it was as though it was the whole thing, the whole installation was within those little triangular facets, everything, you know, that you could see, the microphones and the people and it's just all little kind of little versions of everything, but kind of writ large in each space as well. So the kind of micro and the macro all together, you know, it just really kind of drew you in as you sat there and on the fool's gold and listened. It was really, just really stunning, I thought.
I mean, one of the things to say is that it was really difficult to make this work last year because of all of the lockdowns and trying to figure out how to do a practice anyway during that time of isolation, but how to do a social practice where you're trying to bring everybody into the same space, but also trying to think about an exhibition where people, you know, large groups of people had to choreograph them through a space to allow them to be in it for as long as they want to be in it, but to kind of gently move them through at the same time, and not, you know, I mean, we are still in the time of COVID, but we somehow, particularly here, we seem to have gotten that is still, you know, still an issue. So having to think about how to bring people in. So you talking about Tanita Tikaram, and in many of the bits of memorabilia that make up the show, you know, hopefully people do see an immediate relationship between them and that performer or that music, as well as seeing themselves in those mirrored sculptures that they can sit on, so that they are in it and that they are part of it. They are part of the artwork in some ways.
I thought that was very generous, actually, and really that was one of the main things that I took from being in that space, and felt that it was really generous and inclusive. Just that way that you were welcomed into the space and you could spend time there and think about the things that, you know, you're talking about. So yeah, I think that was incredibly successful, how you did that in that context. Very powerful.
And the invitation to stop and to sit and to listen to each different voice, and then together in another space, I found really, it kind of slowed you down. You just, I felt like I just had to sit there and listen and just kind of pay attention and move from space to space and feel the differences. I mean, watching that, you know, we could get, I could discern the differences between the women's voices, but when they're all in their own space, I just found that really kind of fascinating to zone in on that one person.
I was going to say that your figures are always quite languid. They always seem to be very, like they're resting, or they're waiting, or they're anticipating something. Do you have, you know, why is that? Sorry, that sounds like a harsh question.
I don't know. I think even though they are now, I don't know, maybe it's been about 12 years that I've been working with the figures that I work with now that are kind of quite figurative, I suppose. It slowly morphed from the pictographic kind of imagery to what we see now. But I still see them as pictographic, because they're silhouettes. You know, I often get compared with Cara Walker with her kind of silhouette work, and I'm absolutely adamant that my figures are naked, they're nude. I don't want the work to be bogged down with clothes and fashion and get dated and all that. So they're still pictograms, they're silhouettes, and yes, they are kind of often waiting. Sometimes that's been a criticism, you know, in the past. I remember years ago I got a little note in a exhibition book saying, why do these, so in one sense they were comparing the work with Déjeuner sur l'herbe, and they said, why do these people look like they're just, you know, sitting around in a park having a nice time when they're about to be, you know, shipped off, or they're about to be. But I'm just not interested in making work that is so literal and so kind of, yes, this is exactly this is the story that I'm telling precisely. So yeah, there is an ambiguity about what's about to happen, or what's just happened, or what's going to happen, and to these figures. And since they've become life size, so the first time I made those particular ones, it's very pictorial kind of scale. But since they've become life size, there is a way in which the work holds the audience, in that you could literally walk into that space. You know, they are, you know, they're 5'8", they're 6'2". You know, you can literally be right there and you know, walk right in and compare yourself to, or be part of the narrative that's going on. But yeah. I'm quite into that ambiguity. I don't want it to get any more nailed down in terms of what might be happening to these things. Yeah.
I think similarly. I mean, I have been asked. So, you know, what's the work about? And I mean, I quite deliberately was not saying what the work was about, because I'm not sure I fully know what the work's about. In that it's a process, and it's for me what unfolds in that process, and then working with that material for it to make some kind of sense that isn't necessarily a literal sense or a you know, I suppose I really quite deliberately resist the work that I was making in the 80s, which was very much about telling people what they were seeing. And like, well, there are other things that emerged that you can't control, and I've gone down that route really, in terms of, rather than trying to be didactic about this work, this means this, it's, oh, this is interesting, let's go with it, rather than trying to make a particular meaning. So I always get really stuck when people say, so, you know, what's the work about? Or even you know, when we had a Zoom meeting with the performers like a week before the event at Abbey Road Studios, and they were all saying, so what is it you want us to do, or what is this about? I said, well, actually, I just want to bring you all into the same room and see what happens, but really was being pushed to kind of articulate, well, there must be a meaning, a prior meaning. Well, for me, yeah, the prior meaning is the devotional project, but I just want you to do what you do, or what you feel that you want to do in that space and in that time, which without a script or without being predetermined in some way. The bit that I really love in this 4-part film, when Erin says to the 3 singers, you know, about, you know, you can make a noise, but it doesn't have to be a nice noise. And, you know, for me, that's a really, like, it just kind of opens a window in some way, that it's like, I'm not predetermining what you should be doing as a female singer, which, of course, the expectation might be that you would make a nice noise. And so I think it kind of, she opened the window for them to just see, what can you do when the script hasn't been, you know, written.
And that's really interesting when your work can surprise you as well, and you haven't got it all bolted down, and maybe they were perhaps wanting to be directed in a certain way. Maybe they're used to that in their practices as musicians, but just offering them the space in which to just be and to make a noise and to make sound and to open their mouths and let something happen, and they don't necessarily know what they're going to do, and you don't necessarily know what's going to, you know, in a way it's a big gamble, isn't it, for you, because this is going to be your Venice Biennale exhibition. It's like, well, what if they all, I don't know, what if they don't do anything? What if they just start effing and blinding? It's like, well, yeah, it's interesting. But that's brave.
I think they were much braver than I was, because with each of them, they have a certain reputation.
Yeah, well.
They are their reputation, physically, and you know, they embody their reputation. So, no, they were prepared to go on you know, on this journey without knowing what was going to become of it, but also where they literally were going during the session. And it's literally I would say the entire show consists of one day, basically, of things that have happened in one day, and that it's just kind of been expanded upon. I was going to ask you about your ginger biscuits.
The gingerbread.
Yeah.
And what about them? They're quite nice. I hate gingerbread. I don't like gingerbread biscuits. No, go on. Ask.
No. It was about this question of consuming and the way in which something like that invites and refuses.
Yeah, it attracts and repels at the same time, doesn't it? Which I think that could be a real kind of there's a key words in a way for my practice in a sense. I've been making some form of gingerbread. I don't like calling them gingerbread men. They're called gingerbread. I don't call them men or, you know. But for about, I don't know, 25 years or something. I can't remember now. And you know, every now and then you just have this one idea that is just like quite a good idea. And I just thought, oh God, gingerbread gingerbread biscuits. Because of my interest in the pictographic form of the figure, you should see my flat. I get little men and little women. So I got these cookie cutter presents from friends in the 90s in Amsterdam. And one of them was the man figure, gingerbread man. The other one was a gingerbread woman, but she's got this massive great big skirt on, so I don't use her. It just doesn't work. So, and then I started making them, and I first made them actually in Liverpool. My friend's here, Gordon, who invited me to do that. In the Liverpool Biennale, one of the off-site shows, and I made these gingerbread biscuits, and I put them in little bags, little cellophane bags. You know, if you go to a National Trust place and you go to the shop and you get shortbread in this little, they looked exactly like that, but inside, on the label was the little slave ship logo. And on the back of the label were the ingredients in the gingerbread, because they were in the Tate Liverpool shop, cafe, and they were sold for £1 a bag, and the money went to charity. And on the back of each label were the ingredients, and they were, you know, sugar, molasses, and then I added blood, sweat, tears. And I would kind of hide in the cafe and watch people, so they'd go and get coffee and a cup of tea, and then, oh, gingerbread, oh, shall I get shortbread or shall I get gingerbread? Oh, I'll get gingerbread. And then they get the gingerbread, and then they walk up and and they'd notice, they'd see what they got, and then they would go and sit down and dunk them in their tea and eat them. And the work has evolved. Sometimes I send them through the post, but then they ended up in this configuration of the ship design. And I think I've done it in London, Houston. I've done them all over the world, and everywhere I've done them, people just say, "Oh, can I have one? Can I eat it? Are we allowed to eat them?" Because they're proper, you know. And when I make them at home in my kitchen, and they're so thin and so small, they're literally 2 inches. They cook in about 8 minutes. If I turn my back for a second, a batch will be burnt. And then I have to take the burnt batch out, put my foot on the pedal bin and throw them overboard into the bin. And then the work becomes really performative in that sense. I mean, work is not performative at all, but it's this enacts the throwing overboard, and then I have to make another batch and put them in the oven. But it's a piece of work that I'm going to keep making. I'm going to make it later on this year in Cape Town as well. And it's just one of those things that I kind of trot out. And for me, it's kind of, it's pictographic, it's pretty self-explanatory. I don't feel as though there's a lot that needs to be said about it. I think it's quite a strong kind of piece of work in and of itself. No, you don't agree?
Well, for me, there's lots of things. One, the cut. To there is something, in a way, I think you're inviting a kind of social engagement through these, sweet breads.
Yeah.
So that, there's it's representing a community, but it's also inviting a community, but in very contradictory ways. And so, I do. Even though it might be clear the nature of the work, I think the complications around people wanting to, they want to consume, they want to touch them.
I think there are there are a bit of a hangover from my interest in nursery rhymes, and you know how sinister nursery rhymes and children's stories and fairy tales are. There was something weird about the Gingerbread Man, isn't there? I can't remember. It's this, it keeps recurring, that kind of interest in the kind of bittersweet that is behind a lot of these kind of things.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say that you're implicating the viewer in something quite sinister and pleasurable at the same time. And that's a really complex way of kind of considering the subject matter that you're talking about, and it's so beautifully simple and complex at the same time. But I know Sonia, you've also talked about the idea of time. You've talked about thinking about time in terms of the past and now, and trying to make those connections, and you have as well. And I know lots of colleagues in this room talk about that a lot. You know, the connections between the past, our colonial history, implicated in where we are now. And I just think that, I just wonder whether, you know, you see that connection in both your works, and you both seem not to kind of be very explicit about it, but it's always there.
One of the things, particularly with, in the fourth gallery of the pavilion, there's this gold wallpaper with all the memorabilia that's sat on these kind of gold and glitter pedestals. And when I was making them, most of those objects, CDs and vinyl, so on and so forth, have come from charity shops. And it wasn't until we were kind of installing the show that I kind of realised, one, that the entire show is pretty much about print and the imprint somehow. Both the kind of emotional and as well as the physical. But what I was really struck by is that a lot of, and I didn't want to get rid of the various price tags that were on the memorabilia. So you'd see something that may have started off as £9.99, and then it was 50, and then various. And for me, of course, that's print as much as me making prints or printing the wallpaper. But there's these various levels of print that's there. This is the gallery I'm speaking about. But those price tags tell me the history of that object. But they also tell me the question about not only the journeys that those records, whose hands they've been exchanged through, but also the way in which they've become devalued. And anyone who's into vinyl records and collecting records knows that there are certain performers, you could spend £1,500 on one vinyl, whereas I can literally go in the shop and get an All Saints CD for 10p. And so you start to, the history is embedded in that print somehow, in the various levels of print that are there every day. It's all around us.
Yeah, I mean, when I first met you, I became really aware of your recognition of the history of Chelsea and how it was really important that that is always known and considered and brought to the forefront. And I'm really aware that all your practice, all your thinking is really coming together in terms of bringing the history to the forefront and looking at how it impacts on us now. And I think the same with you, Mary.
I mean, I'm really interested in what you just said about the print, because I think I said very briefly when I was talking that although I was a painter, BA, MMA, it was always mediated through some other process. So there's this so a print, a stamp, a stencil, it just leaves, it pushes the material through another portal, and like you say, and then it gets handled by somebody else, or it just constantly leaving traces of whatever it might be, whether it's a price tag or wallpaper paste or whatever it might be, and that kind of the accrual of the residue that becomes part of the work, I think, is really interesting. And whether that's to do with perhaps historical research, which I'm really, really kind of interested in. It's not always the be-all and end-all, but for me it's a starting point when I start to make something. So I'm showing in Cape Town in later this year, and I'm looking at the history of that history, which is going to be a lot to do, but that the research and the residue will somehow, I don't know how yet, I have not, apart from a couple of things that I know that I will make, I don't know how it's going to end up in the work. You didn't know what those singers were going to do, but somehow you trust the process that it is going to end up somewhere in the world.
I mean, I do think that just making art is an act of trust in some way. Not always rational. You can't always rationalise it, although of course one does huge amounts of talks and thinking and reading and looking at other. You can't always rationalise, and it is an act of trust.
Yeah.
That doing this means something, even if it's not completely understood in the moment that it's being made. Or for some people, they know before they make what it's going to be. It's just not the way, I'm very much process-led, whereas I kind of started off very much as, I know what I'm going to do, and this is what it's going to be, and these are the components. I've kind of switched, you could say.
Was that gradual? Was that a gradual thing?
I think it was always there. I think I was always trying to, as I said, I was studying in the late 70s, which was a hardcore conceptual period where you kind of had to know what you were going to do before you even put the paper out, far less paper and pencil together. So you almost had to have an argument for the work before you'd done it. And I really tried very hard in that period to work in that mode, and I did to a certain extent. But I've mentioned it before. I talked about the way when I'd have tutorials, and the tutors would be very disparagingly kind of saying, "Well, you're really post-intentional because you kind of don't know what you're doing until you've done it," and this meaning it being a bad thing. And it took me a really long time to find a way of trusting the process, and something will come out of the process. Not without of course I'm very involved in all of the a lot of the discourses about practice, but that that it's a possibly valid way to make work, and that's not an argument for not knowing or continuing to not know, but to not know in the moment of making, and then and trusting the process that it will be revealed.
It will be fine.
Yes, it's very interesting. I just wanted to open up in a minute. I'm just aware that there'll be lots of questions, but there's just one last thing I wanted to ask you, which is, I'm really aware about the comments you made about winning the Golden Lion, and how you were obviously really happy to get this recognition, but also that it took so long, and being the first. And I'm aware that Mary is also the first black course leader, female at Chelsea. And I was thinking about the two of you and thinking about, how do you hold all this responsibility about the first, of having to represent, to be in this position? And I just, was thinking about, is it a burden to be in this role? Yeah. It feels like a massive one.
It is.
Yeah.
And of course, those what you're saying comes as an accolade.
Yeah.
And I have been talking about this a lot recently, but what it underneath what that tells me is, we weren't expecting you.
Yeah.
And we hadn't thought of you ever being here.
Yeah.
That somehow you stepped out of your lane.
Yeah.
But it's an accolade at the same time. So it's a set of very confusing signals of, well done you. Oh, well done you. You weren't supposed to be here. How did you get here?
Yeah.
And then, one of the interesting, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It's just interesting that a lot of people have said to me in the last few weeks, that I've won this for us. which is, it's not a bad or a good, it's just really interesting, because it makes me wonder, have all of the artists who've represented a national pavilion been asked to hold that for us, or is it very particular? And what is that question about being a representative about?
Who's the us?
Who's the us? And but also, I mean, of course, I understand whether one's talking about invisibility or limited opportunities, and the prospect of opening doors to make others come through the door. But I kind of also think, that what was it when I when I was opening the pavilion, and I was in floods of tears. I cry very easily, by the way. But there was reason to cry. That suddenly the weight of history really did. I really felt it in a way that I'd been trying to kind of just keep it out of my mind and get on with very, very, very practical things, like getting the work done, making sure that getting just my usual I love lists, or making sure that things are ticked off the list in an attempt to keep all of that somehow at bay. But it wasn't possible. When the exhibition opened, just suddenly seeing a sea of people and just thinking, oh my goodness, this is a big deal, actually.
Oh, it's quite moving. Very, thank you. And I was just wanting to open up to any questions. Jenny, I think we have a mic even. Oh, brilliant, thanks.
Thank you so much for the conversation. I've got two questions. My question is really around both your works, and the connection for me is around the cut, but it's about the offcuts. What did you cut and leave behind? I'm intrigued by it. What didn't make the film? What was the editor's cut? I'm thinking of the Gingerbread Men, and I'm thinking of your forms. The offcuts, where are they and what do they mean? I have a burgeoning passion for semiotics, for anybody who knows me. And to me, those are signs that are left. And I just wonder what they mean for both of you. That's one question. The other question is around, I have to say it, is around issues around decolonising, anti-colonial and post-colonial, and what does it mean to have an OBE or MBE? What do those things mean? What does that mean? And in terms of both your works, I'm really looking forward to you working or doing something together as a collaboration.
I'm just going to just start by talking about what's left, the offcut. So I've got this great big table in my studio. It's 2 and a bit meters, and it's all covered in green cutting mat material, and it's just always there. It's so I'll put a piece of a 2 meter by 90 centimeter piece of brown paper on it that I've drawn on the night before with a projector with figures. And I cut it out. I cut through 2 or 3 sheets at a time. I cut it out really carefully. And what's left on the table is the figure in green cutting mat, because I take the figures away, and then it's... So I'm left with a kind of stencil, in a way, that I could, supposedly, maybe, use for something. As we were saying before, it could be part of another process, kind of left there. I keep those things for a while, and then it just becomes. It's really odd. I make my work out of this paper, but then I also wrap my work out of that paper. So it's really weird when I have to wrap work up to send somewhere. And I'm very aware that I'm using the material that I used to make my work to wrap the work, which is what it's supposed to be used for anyway. So it all gets a little bit convoluted. But I don't know about the MBE thing, that's the Sonia. I can't answer that one.
I was just thinking.
You sure you don't want to answer it? Okay, so for me, the question about the cut, I won't speak specifically about the offcut, but the cut, I think, is about something that's really abrupt and jarring that we get used to. So I think about the history of collage that we understand in terms of, at least within context of the West and 20th century art, is that in its beginnings it was a way of practicing that was very much aligned to politics and to a kind of social awareness, and somehow very quickly became something that was made safe. So we think about collage now as something that is a childlike activity, that, you know, we give kids scissors to cut and play, and it's very much associated with play and something quite infantile, and that actually the politics of it have been evacuated. So when I think about the cut, I'm thinking about the abruptness of something and what it's juxtaposed with, or the context that it's in. In terms of the offcut, I haven't thought about the offcut as such, in that some of the things that I've done in recent years, I am starting to return to look at the material again. And I don't know whether I would call them offcuts or whether I would say that they've just been sitting there waiting for me. So the question about decolonising and post-colonial and OBEs and relationships to relationships to the monarchy or to the empire, that's a really long discussion. It's a very, very long discussion. I'm trying to think how to talk about it in a, and I don't want to gloss over it, but I don't want to ignore it at the same time. What I will say is that, so I have an OB, an MBE and an OB, and when I was first invited to, when it was first offered, I kind of thought, oh, why would I want that? But also, I then thought, what can I do with that? And it's an ongoing question, but it's surprising. It surprises me that actually it does enter me into spaces that I wouldn't have entered before. Mm. And the question then becomes, what can be done there? Mm. But that's a really, really simple response. Mm. And I haven't talked about decolonising or post-colonial, but of course I'm very aware.
Mm. I just want to add one thing. Just about 10 years ago, I had my first solo exhibition in London, and the title of the show was Cut and Paste. And for me, it was very much about being cut as a child from West Africa and pasted into Europe. And that was the whole kind of premise of the show, and the kind of premise of my practice as well. So I remember thinking as a young child, how come we speak English, you know? And then when I was 14, we went back to Nigeria for a couple of years, and when I was 16, I did my O-levels at the time. I remember turning over my paper and it said Oxford University examination form. I was like, wow, really? And then that's when I started to get interested in, well, why is it Oxford University? So I had been studying here at school here, and then I finished my O-levels in Nigeria, but they were the same. And that started me thinking about all this kind of being cut and paste and being the psychogeography of kind of migration and colonialism and imperialism has always kind of fascinated me ever since then.
Can I interject in terms of this question of, and sorry, it may not be directly related, within the work, particularly the work in Venice, but it's something that I've been thinking about for really, and been working around for a really long time, is the relationship between Dada and, you could say, the blues, jazz, scat in particular, and the question of nonsense and howling and what they used to call field hollers, which I can really hear in this piece, and I can hear when I walk around the show, and that we tend to think of representation as being a kind of image-based, but actually through sound has a history. It carries memory, and so for me, within the work that I just showed you here, and the show that's in Venice, and some works that I've done before, where there is this question of this kind of collision, you might say, because I do think actually what was going on in Dada and what was going on in terms of the new age of jazz, or the modernism that jazz suggested, was about a kind of catastrophic experience of at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, around the First World War, around slavery, around all of those things are compounded in both Dada and that early music form, where it's about nonsense and about language no longer making sense. But it's because it doesn't sit within a particular frame of representation or imagery. It's quite hard to talk about this, because I'm not a museologist. But I'm interested in the fact that the way in which Dada might be taught in art schools is a separate track from what was going on in terms of an African American way of speaking about modernity through jazz and through that had come out of plantation life. Yeah. But and every book that I've read about Dada always has at least a sentence that talks about the influence of jazz on Dada, but it then separates as if they're in separate spheres. And for me, this is another kind of cut.
Very interesting. Brilliant. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Oh, yes, a few. Shall we? Who wants it? Yep. Okay.
Right. So, I think my question is a bit abstract, but I was wondering, does the significance of the work sometimes overshadow the significance of the research contribution that your work does? As in the appearance of your work. So I've been wondering, as I go through exhibitions in London, especially in Europe, worldwide, if it feels more like there is an overconsumption in the art world. You know, like people produce a lot of work that expires very quickly and you forget about it. You go into an exhibition, it lingers for a while, but you don't really get to have a conversation or see the artists actually conversing and explaining their work in depth. So I wonder if the consumption of the viewer is just very temporary and fleeting, and they don't actually get to take part in the creation of the work. So like a lot of the research that you do when you actually create the work itself just gets lost, and it doesn't really last in society. It doesn't, like the contribution that you're making towards what you're working for in your practice just seems to, I don't know, fade away or sink.
I don't know. I'm not sure that I would characterize it in that way. I mean, of course, one sees in this field that we're in, sees probably millions of works, but they somehow have an accumulative effect. So, however fleeting a moment might be with a particular artwork, for some reason it does leave a residue. And for those of us that are making, we take that residue and do something with it. So you know, maybe it's an immaterial value that one might be talking about rather than something that you can say, all right, that material thing did that, and will always do that. And of course, one's relation to works change as well. I mean, it's difficult to. And what's wrong with something being temporary?
Well, it's not really that it's temporary. I think things are really meant to be built to last forever. But I do think that in a world or in a society that's continuously changing, I wonder, just like in the way that we consume things and eat things, if it's just not meant to be something that's supposed to be consumed for deeper thought. You know, if it's just something that people go to for entertainment, or just to have like a temporary thought about it, just to be immersed into it on a temporary basis and then forget about it, or just to seem like they're part of something but not something that's lasting or that they're part of development.
How will we know?
That's the thing, you don't. So I was just wondering,
It's a gamble.
does it have an impact on you as an artist in your work?
That's.
I feel as though, yes, you might go to an exhibition for half an hour, engage with an artist's practice for a short time, but the research that we do as artists is the propeller for our practice. But then we do things like this. We do talks, and we engage with publics, and we teach, and that research and that experience gets disseminated, I think, in various ways. It's not just only the half an hour visit that you make to an exhibition. I think it lives on in various other forms.
But I suppose I would challenge that it absolutely has to. One, and I'm also not sure that we know where those experiences live, if that makes sense. And my example would be the way that I started to make work about music was I was doing a residency in, this was in the mid-90s in Manchester, and I remembered a song from my teenage years, and I sang that song to myself as I was walking down the street and thought, oh my gosh, I've remembered the entire song. And I hadn't thought of that song for over 20 years, but somehow I remembered it. I went to the studio and I wrote it down, and then I made a work from it. So even though, if someone had said to me, can you think of a song from 20 years ago? But the thing was that somehow it was living there somewhere in me, and it decided to pay a visit. I didn't know when I was a teenager that would have stayed, although I loved that song when I was a teenager. I didn't, I thought I'd grown out of it. I have sung it many times in this kind of context. I don't want to do that to you guys today.
This is a question for Sonia. Haven't been to the Venice Biennale yet, so this is my first exposure to your installation, which I think is really powerful. And I see a lot of gold, and I see a lot of geometric figures, shapes. So I was wondering if you could explain us your interest into the material and to this kind of language.
So I have, for the last few years, been really taken with geometric constructions, and I can't even remember how I got to hear about. There's a natural mineral called pyrite, and sometimes it's called fool's gold, and actually conversations with Neve. We did lots of research online and realised that these pyrite can come out of the ground in a perfectly geometric form. which I kind of think is wow. Because when like, looking online thinking, oh, that's been carved. No, it's not. That's how it came out of the ground. So I really, because I've been looking at and really interested in the word kind of geometric, abstract forms, thought, oh, this is really interesting. So kind of go down that particular rabbit hole. And the more of finding out about pyrite or fool's gold, the more I found it really interesting and but particularly inspired me visually, as well as what the material is, what the mineral is. Now, when kind of working with Emma Ridgway and with Neve on the design for the pavilion, I was clear that I wanted the wallpapers to kind of reference these kind of geometric tessellating shapes, but also in the studio, and was having a kind of long-running joke with myself about rock stars and wanting to make rock stars, and while also playing often in the studio Shirley Bassey's Goldfinger. Now, although that's not that, it's humorous, but that it literally was fueling, trying to kind of make sense of all this material, knowing that I liked, I was really interested in these kind of angled, I suppose, forms that are automatically, from where we sit now, seen as part of the kind of lexicon of modernist sculpture, and kind of modernist design as well. So it was, really, but to be honest, I was, I'm moving between the two of thinking, God, I really like that shape. I really, how can I get the work to, and I've done a few things that have kind of referenced pyrite and that kind of form. Sorry, it's not a good enough answer.
So we have time for one more question, and then we'll continue the conversation in the banqueting hall where we have drinks. So please do join us, because it would be really wonderful to have a more informal conversation. I have a question here, I'm sorry. But we can take the question later and have a conversation. That's okay.
Hi, it's a question for Sonia. I was wondering, I was very interested at one point to see the singer answering each other through repetition, especially I'm a Queen, and within that there was a dialogue of emotion between them, and I was wondering if that was wanted. I mean, if you wanted a repetition, or it reminded me of a bit of Meisner as an actor. I'm a former actress, so that's what I used to do. So I was wondering if this was wanted, if this was unintentional, this kind of sub-dialogue between the performer.
Much of the work I do, particularly in recent years, is that I'll have a space for a performance to take place, but it's always unscripted. No one knows what's going to happen. Erilyn, who composer who took part in the project, said that she would be coming in to help guide, because she's a composer for voice, so she works with singers. There was no script, so there was no knowing that was going to happen. And this film is literally of the first 20 minutes, or that they were in the studio in Abbey Road Studios. So no one knew what was going to happen. And this, in a way, I think what I've experienced happening when performances that I've augmented come together is that there's, first of all, a very, really protracted sense of awkwardness at the beginning, of like people jostling, and then something happens, and whoosh, they find a way to negotiate that space and have a dynamic dialogue. And I think that's what one's experiencing there, is that at first there's, you know, someone's testing a bit, and they're at first it seems like they're very much in their own, they're kind of nervous and kind of embarrassed a little bit of making these noise, and then suddenly, whoosh, they are in a dialogue where it's funny and it's competitive, and you can really tell their skills, and you know, you can see that they're kind of pacing, someone's keeping a particular rhythm going, and that they're working together. But it's not as simple and straightforward working together for some good. It's out of the experience of playing and saying, oh, okay, we can do this game, and going for that.
Thank you so much. That was amazing.
Yeah,
thank you both.
Thank you.
Was such a wonderful, incredible moment, and I am so grateful for you both for being here. And let's just go and have a drink and continue.